Like, I think, it used to be like maybe in our parents' generation, it's like you wore Chanel No. 5, and that was like the only fragrance you ever wore for the rest of your life. But, identity is no longer like this static destination. I totally feel that like we are always evolving and reinventing ourselves is really important. And I think fragrance can have the power to be a part of that journey too.
Exactly. Like when you put on Cowboy Kush, for example, it's like, it's such a confidence that I feel like when I spray that onto my pulse points, nobody can tell me anything.
Yeah.
And that's who I am that day.
Totally.
So you grew up in Austin, Texas.
I did, yeah.
What was your relationship like with scent back then?
I mean, kind of probably like anybody's, like scent has this like crazy power to like transport you.
Absolutely.
And I think the first time I like viscerally really remember that experience, I was walking down the street in New York City when I lived there, and somebody just passed me by and I smelled them. I was like, oh my God, that's my grandfather's cologne. But like, I don't remember my grandfather wearing cologne. And if you ask me now, like what he smelled like, I couldn't remember, but like getting a waft of it, like it was like total recall for like,
Absolutely.
like 30 seconds, which is so interesting. But like, I think, growing up, there's since like playing in the dirt and maybe like, certain flowers that my parents had, or like the smell of like mowed grass, or like the smell of going to the beach during the summer on family vacations. Like those are the scents I kind of remember,
Mm-hmm.
But then, I was always kind of fascinated by my parents, vanities. My dad kind of had his like very classic kind of masculine sense,
The green
like
bottles.
yeah,
Right?
exactly. Yeah, like the polo. I think there was like that polo Ralph
Yes.
Lauren's and the green bottle. He wore like Castle and Massey Greenbrier, a lot of kind of like bergamonty kind of like, scents. And then my mom, she wasn't a big fragrance wearer, but she did have a lot of like scented powders and scented soaps and things like that, more kind of like just like pretty things that made you feel more luxurious, And so I think I really fell in love with like the scent of like rose or violet, these more kind of like cosmetic-y kind of like old school kind of like feminine scents too. So I think I was like, really fascinated by both. I think I love the idea that these things somehow were like, I don't know, like they kind of like signified like adulthood or something like that. Like there just seemed to be this kind of like extra special cool treat that like was like, oh, one day I'll get older and I'll get to have these kinds of things or something.
Right. That's how you know you've made it, when you have your green bottles and your scented powders. But it's interesting too, growing up, I grew up in the South as well. And I feel like people had very much treated scents like in a very binary school of thought. So like
for sure,
the rose and the violet you were speaking of, as much as it's a scent, it doesn't have a gender, people would classify it as such. And I think that's what's interesting about boy smells, is you're doing away with that.
Yeah. So the kind of the main pillar of boy smells is something that we call genderful rather than like genderless. I think, for me, I really call on both my masculinity and my femininity every day. And I find a lot of fullness in my identity, and I find a lot of fullness through calling on those kind of like two sides of a spectrum. I think gender is really three-dimensional, gender identity, gender expression, they're all different. And, I think we all have our like muses and icons and influences, and whether it be yin, yang, solar, lunar, masculine, feminine, I think that the world is kind of full of dualities. And the more you kind of explore both sides of the coin, like the fuller your experience is. And I think the more powerful you are and stuff. So when we talk about genderful, we talk about just kind of, gender inclusion. It's really more about being your best self, like exploring the full spectrum of your identity. And I think we're in a really cool place in culture and right now where like that's very popular, you know.
Definitely.
But growing up, you know, in Texas, like I don't think like, you know, experimenting with your identity and your gender and kind of, you know, it was very much like, you know, fraternity, sorority, you know, like you know, which is great. And I'm not dissing on any of that
Right.
culture whatsoever, but it was a very binary kind of experience. You know, everybody was, you know, husband and wife, and, you know, everybody knew each other. Everybody's kind of not involved in each other's business, but, you know, everybody kind of knew what you're up to. It was a very small community. So, you know, or a tight knit community. So, you know, kind of growing up in those circumstances, you know, I didn't feel like I got the freedom as much as I would have liked to play, experiment, get to know myself better, like in a more genuine way. I think I'm a queer individual, and I think that growing up in those experiences, you kind of like figure out the personality that like you like about yourself, but that also other people like,
Right.
because, you know, you're a little bit, you know, that maybe like there's something about you down deep that's different and that feels like a little dangerous, you know, especially if there's not a lot of celebrated role models that like kind of reflect back to you your own experience or your own identity. So, you know, like you kind of pick up on little micro, you know, negative reactions, or, you know, you just kind of get this idea that certain things are dangerous territory. And like, even like my mom's vanity, which I said, which was kind of fascinating with, I definitely had a sense of like, I like this, but I know I'm like not supposed to like this because this isn't for boys. And like, that might be dangerous or get me in trouble or whatever. So, you know, me coming into my own, you know, I kind of came out in my late teens, early 20s, and, you know, I was kind of like, oh, I've got this, you know, like I came out, like I'm, you know, I've mastered, there's nothing for me to figure out, you know, like I'm good, I did it. But then kind of as I got into like my later 20s, I just kind of realized like, am I really the person that I've always wanted to be, or am I still holding back? Like, what have I not explored? And I think that kind of unwinding that ball of string of like, because you're so sure of your identity, because it's kind of always been the person that you've decided that you are. But if you look back, you're like, what have I made different decisions? What have I explored different things about myself? And so kind of questioning that, fragrance became like a big part of that for me. You know, I remember going to, you know, rest in peace, Barney's,
Oh, yeah.
you know, and like exploring like fragrances that had like rose or tulip or jasmine or violet in them, and being like allowing myself to kind of like wear those fragrances. And like they were so some cool companies doing really interesting things, and like just feeling like, oh, the mix of these ingredients is so elevated and like so sophisticated, and it feels so me. I felt like myself reflected back in a fragrance. I'm like, oh my God, it takes like all the things about myself that like maybe I didn't even like, or I was embarrassed about, or I didn't know that I didn't like these things about myself, but like all the feminine notes, and took like some really cool masculine notes. Cause like I'm also like, you know, like I like to go out there and get it done, and, you know, have these kind of like, you know, this kind of masculine testosterone-y drive too, you know, which, but like I have all these sensitivities and things like that too. And so wearing these fragrances that like pictured myself back to me in a way that wasn't like shameful, or like, it was like elevated and like so fabulous. And like, I was like, oh my God, like it allowed me to see myself in the way that I had always seen myself, but maybe not, I felt like maybe not everybody else did or something. So, you know, when we talk about Genderful, I think I talk about that experience, you know, like at Boy Smells, we want to always take something that's traditionally masculine and traditionally feminine, remix it together, and, you know, serve up, you know, scents for modern identities. And, you know, there's other really fun things like I don't know, like fun, weird fruit notes that you can pull in, and you're like, oh, that's kind of like oh yeah, I'm a little kooky today. Like I'm gonna wear this, or, you know, you pull in leather and it's like, you know, very sleek and like feels like super lush and sexy. And then, you know, so it's not just masculine and feminine. It's just really recombining notes that like kind of pull together like, you know, different personalities.
Exactly. It's like an expression of yourself, a silent expression, but when you smell it, it's like, that's exactly who I am. That's who I'm going to be today. And like you were saying, it kind of like taps into something within you where maybe you were quiet about it before, but now you're ready to turn the volume up.
Yeah, exactly. We use like the 3 E's. Explore, embrace, express.
I love that.
And I think that like, when you get a new fragrance, you wear it and you're kind of like, oh my God, this is bringing out a whole different personality in me. And that's the explore. And then you like figure out if you like it or if you don't. And then you embrace that into like a broader definition of yourself. And then you're ready to go out there and like express it back out into the world, which I think is super cool.
I love that. And so you have such a expansive career in high-end fashion. We were talking about it a little bit before we got on the horn here.
Yeah.
But I'd love to hear more about your work there and what it was like behind the scenes of these really fun, exciting swirls of chaotic energy at times at the fashion shows, and what that impact made on you and your perspective on scent.
So yeah, I think working in fashion might not have informed scent as much as like just brand. I've always loved fashion. It's what I knew I wanted to do even when I was a little kid. Anytime in a movie or like a TV show and there was something to do with like actual behind the scenes fashion, I was just like so enamored by it. And I went to school in London for it and got to work for some amazing designers in London and worked for some amazing designers in New York, all kind of like runway based. And a lot of young designers too, like people like just starting their businesses. So that was a really cool experience for me to see kind of like what it's like to build an organization and stuff like that. Saw a lot of like mistakes and saw a lot of successes, and fashion's a business where there's a lot of new brands every year and a lot of brands go out of business, and it's very intense. Right before a runway show, you can work for like many weeks without a day off. Sometimes like the days before a runway show, you work many days with only getting, a handful of hours of sleep at night. And so I think that was good. It taught me a lot of grit, like very, very competitive, like, you get ahead by being the person who works the hardest, a lot of those kinds of lessons I learned there. And then, building the world of a culture of a brand is like so exciting, and being on photo shoots and like understanding like what are the signature through lines from collection to collection that makes this like a brand, like what's the point of view of the brand and stuff like that. So I think all of those things have really served me well. And I think one thing about Bowie Smells that might stand out is that, we kind of treat it more like a fashion brand than we do a fragrance brand, but that's only because like everybody who works there, it kind of comes from fashion. And I don't know, like I think that, that elevation, of like seeing something and trying to like make it look really kind of like beyond, is like something that I absolutely adore, and creating the fantasy and stuff like that is something I love. So I think that's been like really useful things to pull into like building Bowie Smells and being in fragrance.
Definitely. And I mean, fashion is all about expression, as is scent. And you've been able to pull that into your company now, which I would love to hear about the starts of Bowie Smells. I hear you started it out of your LA kitchen. What did that look like?
I'm actually like in the process of like fixing that house up, and I might sell it, but there's like oil stain rings from like fragrance drums, like all over the house, because the whole house, well, it started in the kitchen. Okay. So let me back up. It started in the kitchen, and we were really just me and David, the other co-founder of Bowie Smells. We lived together at that time. And, we were just like, David was working in production in high-end fashion as well. I had moved to LA and I was working at Nasty Out. And we were just like, oh my gosh, so many deliveries, like a collection every month, hundreds of designs, and we were just like, what? We'd love to do something that just kind of slowed down a little bit. And so we started making candles, and it was really David's idea to start making them because he's much more kind of like figure things out, like how do we make this kind of person. And I was just always such a scent junkie. So I kind of was, like, oh, I love scent. So like, I was really in there kind of like mixing stuff that we found on the internet and just like, kind of just really blind, dumb luck, just kind of like trying to figure out how to make candles as a hobby. And so we did that for a couple of months, and then we kind of got a couple scents that we were like really into, you know, but really like stuff that we bought off the internet. And so just through our connections and friends in fashion, we were like, got the box made, ordered the glass, and we just like made a small run. And I remember taking it in to like some girlfriends who were worked with me at Nasty Gal because it was just a side hustle then. And like people were just like flipping out over it. They just loved like the fact it was called Boy Smells and it came in a pink box. And like, you know, for me, calling it Boy Smells and putting it in a pink box was like, oh, I'm a boy and I'm allowed to like floral scents. So I'm going to like call it Boy Smells and put it in a pink box because it was made by boys. But like all my girlfriends at work, you know, they're wearing like chunky Rolexes and boyfriend blazers, and they're wearing Tuscan leather by Tom Ford or Santal 33. And like, those are really masculine scents. And so they saw the pink box, but it was called Boy Smells. And it was like this sense of permission, kind of like both ways to like, you know, occupy space outside your expected gender Venn diagram or whatever, you know? And it kind of was just like this sense of permission to expand that circle. And that's what I was getting out of it. But I didn't realize that it would kind of be a two-way street. I kind of was like, oh, this is like this little like gay candle company and we're never going to go anywhere. It'll just be kind of this thing that we do on the weekends and stuff. But like that, the gender conversations come like so far and so fast. And also there's just like a big sense of humor with the brand. And we come up with like really fun names for all of the candles and the fine fragrances. But so when we started it in the kitchen, you know, we just gave it to friends and family. It was just me and David, like hawking candles. And then we got like a first big order. We stayed up all night, like the whole dining room table was just empty jars. And we were like melting wax in a wax melter and like putting in the fragrance and it was kind of like that for a while. And then it slowly started to get bigger and a little bit bigger. Then we got a factory that would make them for us, but you know, our POs weren't big enough. And so we were always like at the back of the line and like things would always deliver late to us because, you know, we just weren't a top priority for anybody. And then we grew a little bit more. And then our friend Kari joined the business and she's our first employee. She still works with us. And it was like kind of like went from the kitchen to the kitchen and the dining room.
Okay.
Then the kitchen, the dining room, and the living room. And then the kitchen, the dining room. And it was just like, all of a sudden, by the time we actually moved out of the house, there was just like inventory in the upstairs hallways and the guest bedrooms and just like, and we were shipping everything out of there too. And so we moved to an office a couple years ago and we were like, you know, shipping all wholesale, all D2C out of that office. It was crazy, you know, and every year we like, you know, doubled the business and just kept growing and growing and growing. But we, you know, we didn't pay ourselves for a long time. We didn't have any rent overhead. We just kind of put every cent we made back into making more candles.
Right.
Yeah.
The house that Boy Smells built.
Yeah, exactly.
I remember, I was working in magazines at the time when you guys launched, and I was like, oh, this is it. Everybody at the office, I remember, was freaking out over these beautiful samples that were sent over. And I remember my friend writing a story, and I was like, they're cool. Like, they get it. You were doing something completely new in the scent space, especially for home fragrances, which I feel were very, like, one thing or another.
Yeah.
But one thing that I loved that you had said about Boy Smells was the brand is a reflection of who you are and that you wish it existed when you were in high school too. And it's like a love letter to the previous version of yourself. Is there a particular scent that kind of speaks to that former self that you've created?
Well, I think the whole like genderful concept and that sense of permission to like explore beyond like the definitions or expectations of those around you. I wish I had more of that sense of permission when I grew up, you know? And so I think having a brand like Boy Smells, you know, would have been cool for me to kind of have that, you know, sense of encouragement to kind of, you know, I mean, the brand name is so silly and funny and it comes in a pink box. And I think just kind of like, just making those kinds of decisions less serious and more kind of playful. I think identity is really playful, but when you don't feel free to explore your identity can become really scary, you know?
Definitely.
And so, you know, I think that I've tried to bring in like a sense of playfulness into my life. And, you know, I've always been a playful person, and I've always loved jokes and stuff like that. But like playfulness in our actual identities and who we are and how we represent ourselves, I think that's something that, you know, kind of takes a long time to learn if you haven't felt the space to do it to begin with.
For sure. And I mean, identity, you don't have to be the same person that you were yesterday or the week before, and you should have room to play with it. It shouldn't always be so serious. And I love how Boy Smells does take that playfulness, and it's also very self-aware.
Yeah, I totally agree. Like, I think, you know, it used to be like maybe in our parents' generation, it's like you wore Chanel No. 5, and that was like the only fragrance you ever wore for the rest of your life. But, you know, identity is no longer like this static destination. You know, it's always evolving. We're always reinventing from, you know, like just, you know, our politics, sexuality, taste, design, whatever. It's like you're always consuming and evolving and growing. And, you know, I want fragrances that feel that dynamic and have a couple that are in my rotation and bring out different parts of our personality. And so I totally feel that we are always evolving and reinventing ourselves is really important. And I think like fragrance can have the power to be a part of that journey too.
Exactly. Like when you put on Cowboy Kush, for example, it's like, it's such a confidence that I feel like when I spray that onto my pulse points, nobody can tell me anything.
Yeah.
And that's who I am that day.
Totally.
I would love to get a little bit into the product line with you and just hearing the story behind each of some of the products. Cowboy Kush, for example.
Yeah. Well, so Kush was kind of our first hit fragrance, the original Kush. And obviously the world's come a long way too. That was kind of before the legalization of cannabis. And, you know, it kind of felt like it was like definitely part of the culture, but not like, you know, obviously it's so different. The landscape now around like CBD and cannabis is so different now than when we invented Kush. But it was such a hit that we kind of wanted to like see if we could franchise out kind of that thing. And I was like, oh, like I love this idea of like Cowboy Kush, you know, like doing this kind of like, you know, more rustic, leathery kind of version. And, you know, cannabis strains themselves all have all these different kind of olfactive. It's like wine, you know, they like different tannins and stuff like that. So we invented Cowboy Kush, and it's like, you know, it now surpasses regular Kush, I think, on our D2C sales. It's such a great scent, and it's really so fun. And it's funny. I'm sure you'll ask me about a slow burn in a little bit, but like, when we were inventing Cowboy Kush, that's right around when Kacey DM'd us and was like, we should do something. And I was like, oh my God, I'm working on this scent. We should call it Cowgirl Kush, you know? Fun. And so, but she was like, oh, and then we kind of went the whole thing of like, oh, we should do something called Slow Burn. But that's a fun little anecdote. But, you know, yeah, I love it. Cowboy Kush is great. It's very confident, like you said.
I mean, since we're talking about slow burn, let's talk about slow burn. So it all started in the DMs.
All started in the DMs.
Love that. So much happens in the DMs.
So much happens in the DMs, indeed. Kacey's great. She's such a fantastic person, and she has really good taste, which is really makes it really easy to work with her.
Yeah.
And the whole thing was so fun. She DM'd us, and then we decided we'd do it. And then I went to New York, and we went to the fragrance houses all day. And like, you know, they presented different things, and we found a couple things we liked. And, you know, like we started to create and pull out certain notes and all that kind of stuff. But the cool thing about Kacey is that, you know, we have genderful values, and, you know, genderful values are for everybody. Because, you know, for Kacey, you know, country music is this very old school boys club environment. And I know she's told me that a lot of country music radio stations won't play her music, or that she wasn't allowed to be nominated for a country music Grammy and stuff. And, you know, she doesn't really kowtow to the expectations of others. And, you know, she's a woman writing and producing her own music in Nashville, which is actually like pretty rare from what I hear. And so, you know, for her, she's totally expanding the definition of her gender in that world. So she definitely, whenever we do a collab, it always has to like fall, just doesn't match our values, you know, So Kacey does, which is really great. And yeah, so we just went to the fragrance houses. We picked the scent. I designed some packaging. She had some comments. It went back and forth. We even like planned the entire event and the decor of it, what people would eat at it, all together. She's super hands-on partner. And, we came out with that candle right at the end of that album cycle, and it just sold out in like an hour or something like that. We thought we had like purchased enough units to like, because we had never done anything like that.
Right.
I just didn't know, like we had no example or case study to figure it out. So that was February of 2020.
Oh, wow.
And then it sold out in like, I don't know, some crazy short amount of time. And then all of a sudden there was like a 20,000 person like wait list for it. And we took pre-orders on it. And we're like, this will ship out, in May or something like that. Or I think it was not May. I think that's when it actually did ship out, but I think we said it would be like 3 months or something. So about a month later, we were in Paris for sales during Paris Fashion Week, and that's when like COVID happened.
Right. Everything changed.
Yeah. And so we like flew back early, but then supply chain got totally crazy. The candle factory got shut down. And so like doing those having a hit product with a lot of demand while the world is shutting down was definitely a very interesting and kind of like, it was a wild ride for sure. Like figuring all of that out logistics wise was like, we definitely had to learn a lot very, very quickly. But we had a really great team and we did figure it out. But that's a whole, that year, the company grew really fast, and because, everybody wanted a candle, but that whole time period is like a whole nother several chapters I could talk on and on and on about.
Yeah. Can you tell me about the notes that you used in Slow Burn?
Yes. Slow Burn is exactly like it sounds, I think of Slow Burn also as like kind of like an ember, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And so it definitely has this warm glow to it. So it has like incense and frankincense and tonka bean and some really like rare woods in there, but it also has like a little bit of rose and a little bit of like raspberry blossom in there, or raspberry leaf in it. And so it kind of has this like a touch of sweetness, a touch of sharpness. And that rose obviously is like so voluptuous, in scent. And it's got a little bit of spice in there too. It's just really kind of like, and that incense note I think is like what really kind of like carries, the whole thing. But yeah, it just has that kind of like, the raspberry and the rose gives that warmth to it. The incense gives that smokiness with the woods, and then the spice gives that extra kick. It really is kind of like exactly what you would think the song would smell like.
Oh, amazing. You can put the song on and burn it.
Yeah, exactly. People do all the time. We get there's a lot of TikToks about that.
Yes. I mean, well, speaking of collaborations, congratulations on your recent collab with Grace Jones. I'd love to hear about that candle. Yeah,
Grace is fantastic. That candle's amazing. When we thought about like who we would want to work with after Slow Burn, I was like, I think, Grace Jones like really reflects our brand values so much. Yes. She's kind of the original gender disruptor, and she's always been equally masculine as she is feminine. And that's probably why she's like, seems so powerful, Grace Jones, slave to the rhythm.
Are you feminine? Do you like being masculine?
I like being both, actually. I mean, I'm a lot. It's not being masculine. It's an attitude, really. Being masculine, what is that? I mean, can you tell me what is being masculine? I mean, I think that I just act the way I feel.
you know, she's above and beyond expectations. And she's a fabulous person as well. And that scent, I love so much. It's like salty musks and like freesia and rose and bergamot and black pepper. And then there's this like gravel accord in it. She was really inspired by this idea of like after the rain in Jamaica and like the salty sea air and all like the flora of the island and stuff. And it's just a really kind of like, it's really sexy. And we were also talking about like her old outfits and like leather alaya and like performing and these like fragrances that she used to wear. And we kind of like pulled on a little bit of everything, you know, to create this scent. And it's fantastic. It really is.
Oh my gosh, I'm so excited to smell it. Violet ends. Who are you when you put on violet ends?
Violet ends for a long time was my number one go-to.
Okay.
Like it was really at kind of it's super genderful. I'll put it that way. It is like violet and rhubarb and bergamot, these very alive kind of like pretty, you know, traditional fragrance things. And the violet is like so kind of, I love violet. It's such a pretty scent. But then it mixes like black tea and tobacco and birch tar and like all these kind of like really, really moody things. So on one end, it's like very pretty and like very alive and like a hint of fruit and like really sweet and cute. And then on the other end, it's like super moody and super grumpy and kind of stormy. And I just love that scent because I think it's really, everything we do is genderful, but that one to me felt like very me. It felt like very like personal. And it's not like the one I wear every day anymore because we've created so many things since then. And I'm always kind of in love with like what's next. But yeah, that one's a classic. It's one of our best sellers. It's really fantastic.
Yeah, and for good reason. Does it kind of take you back to that point in your life whenever you smell it?
For sure, yeah. I mean, I remember working like when I smell that scent, I think about like the marketing decks we were working on and the campaign around it and like, you know, like what we, you know, everything that it meant to us at the time. And I remember getting the final mod in from the fragrance house and we like finally got it to the right point and it was exactly what we wanted it to be. And it just has that kind of like, it has like a really beautiful tension in it too. And we were still in the pandemic. And I think there was something kind of just about that, like, you know, sense of tension in the air, you know,
so
of
much
like,
tension.
of like hope and also despair and like, you know, kind of all those like, you know, that whole kind of melting pot of like unknown and stuff like that felt like really right for then.
Definitely. Last but certainly not least, the Hinoki Fantôme candle. I'd love for you to go into that and what you love so much about it.
Hinoki Fantôme was another one of those, like, you know, when we released it, we loved it, but we didn't realize like how popular it would be. And that one's just beautiful. It has a beautiful, you know, Hinoki, Japanese cypress note, and then which is the Hinoki, and then the Fantôme part is Phantom, you know, it's the other side, the across the veil. So there's all these like cades and frankincense and birch tars and all these like smoky, oody kind of notes in there. And that's another one where we've kind of created other Fantôme scents off of it. So we came out with Tea Fantôme, which takes like black tea and eucalyptus and then mixes it with all those smoky ingredients. And then we have Copal Fantôme, which really focuses on like the copal and then mixes in all those leather and tobaccos and smoky and all that kind of stuff. So it's really fun to like play with the whole Fantôme idea because you can really do any scent and then do Fantôme. So it's really about like, how do you take something and then add all this kind of like smokiness to it? And they're all very like centering, kind of like almost like meditative scents, you know, because it has that very kind of like, feels kind of ancient, you know, but modern at the same time.
Yeah, like it's a moment for yourself and it's a ritual.
Yeah, exactly.
Ready to play Scent Connection?
Yes, sure.
So Scent Connection is our rapid fire segment where we will play scent associations. In this edition, we have some iconic artists that challenge the binary, but also were impactful to you. And I'd love to know the scent or feeling that comes up when we speak about them.
Okay.
So let's kick it off with David Bowie.
Oh, it'd have to be something kind of electrifying, right?
Oh, yes.
Something very sparkly on top, probably. Something that feels kind of almost like fizzy. Probably like some citrus in there. I don't know. Like definitely some spice notes on top. Maybe some fresh like aldehydes. I don't know. Like something very kind of like alchemical, you know?
Yes.
Yeah, some herbs too in there. You know, something very like almost spacey and earthy in the
exactly.
same time.
He's the Starman.
Yeah, exactly.
So next we have Freddie Mercury.
Definitely, I feel like musk would be a big one on that. Salty, something kind of like brash and loud. Maybe there's some oud and some like splinters of woods like cedar and sandalwood and stuff.
I love that. Patti Smith.
Oh, I feel like patchouli and tulips and, you know, kind of things that just meander. And I love her lyrics and they kind of just are so fluid and stuff. So maybe some like kind of seasideness in there too, just to give it some like wateriness and some fluidity in there would be cool too.
I like it. Harry Styles.
I mean, it's gotta be watermelon.
Of course.
For sure. I don't know, but flowers too. Like, I really love his style and kind of just his overall like playfulness and stuff. So definitely like some fruit notes, some flowers, something like fun and fresh and kind of not too serious.
Yes, I feel like that's very Harry.
Yeah.
And of course, the icon, the legend, Dolly Parton.
Well, it's got to smell like meadows and daisies and honeysuckles and just everything like, you know, pure Americana happiness, you know, fresh cut grass, things like that.
Oh, I love it. Jolene could never.
I love Dolly Parton. She's like, to me, like, I don't know, like a prophet or something, you know, she's everything. I think that she's wise and like the way that she lives her life and the principles she lives by are just absolutely what we should all aspire to.
I agree. So I know one of your big influences when you were in fashion was Alexander McQueen. Can you tell me a little bit more about that and the impact that his work had on you?
I mean, McQueen's influence on me was kind of went even back to like high school. Because I remember, like, I used to stay up late and watch, like, fashion TV and stuff. I think it was, like, on E! Or something. And, you know, I loved, like, staying up late and trying to always catch that. And he had this interview where he talked about, like, the duality of everything and the tension of dualities. And that, like, just, like, totally opened something up in me, you know? Like, this idea of, like, two sides of one coin, like, interacting with each other. And then he was talking about how, like, you know, he was mixing these ideas of drapery with these, like, structured ideas of tailoring. And, like, a jacket would kind of, like, devolve into, like, a draped dress and things like that. And I thought that that was just so interesting, you know? Like, masculinity is very much, like, linear thinking. And it's, you know, very binary. So, you know, and tailoring is really like that. You know, it's all about like cutting up the cloth and like defining the body. And then I love this idea of like tailoring, of drapery being feminine. It's much more holistic thinking rather than linear thinking. It's a holistic treatment of the fabric itself and how it drapes. And this kind of, I started to like, there were just like different little moments, you know, where like somebody just says something in your life and you're like, that's now informs kind of how I see everything.
Yeah.
And so there was another book that I read called The Alphabet versus the Goddess that talked about how like literacy overstimulates our masculine side of the brain, whereas like visual art stimulates our feminine side of the brain. And like this idea of like feminine and masculine thinking and like and how they like intersect has always been super interesting to me. So there's been a couple of moments like that where you're just like, and then it kind of, you go through the rest of your life kind of understanding like that there are dualities in all of us that should be kind of explored and expressed, and to cut yourself off from one half of yourself is to do yourself kind of an injustice.
Exactly. It's kind of giving you a disadvantage if you're like completely ignoring this one side of you just because it's different from what you know.
Yeah, totally. And it's like, it doesn't even have to be masculine and feminine. I think one thing that's interesting in fragrance is like, you know, there's all this kind of implicit sexism and based in expectations around what you smell like. So like men are supposed to smell like woods and musks because they're like animalistic and strong, you know? And it's kind of like toxic masculinity. And then women are supposed to smell like flowers and fruits. And those are things that like perish easily and like are delicate. And like there's kind of this like fragility, this implied fragility in those sense too. So I think of myself as like I think of like when I think of flowers and fruits, I think of like my more emotional side. And when I think about like woods or musks, I think about more my like analytical side and like, you know, that kind of sense of like getting something done with like the emotion around you that's happening. Like that's kind of intuition to me, you know? So for me, always like pulling on your masculine and your feminine always feels like the most powerful way to like go through a situation and to like best inform your judgment around something. So when we talk about genderful or we talk about genderful fragrances, it's really just trying to like kind of take like a more holistic approach to like your own identity.
And you had me thinking like, oh my gosh, that's so right. Like women leaning fragrances are so fragile. And
well, I guess the metropolitanization of America, when people started moving out of the country and into cities, like gender roles started becoming a lot more defined and marketed to, and like women started staying at home and like men started going out to work, whereas before like everybody just pitched in on the farm, you know what I mean? And so like, you know, just from a marketing point of view, you know, people just started to like become a lot more binary and like how the products and how they defined the genders, you know.
Interesting. I love how the boy smells mission is kind of like undoing that.
Yeah.
Hi, dear.
Oh, hello, Tom. I didn't hear you come in.
Have you been a good girl today?
Yes, Daddy.
I'll bet you have. I'll just bet you have.
You know, Tom, if you would take the...
One thing that I really loved was how you positioned, or you spoke about how Boy Smells was a love letter to your younger self. And I know I have no right to be, but I'm like so proud of you and how you've really just disrupted the scent industry with Boy Smells. And I'm a big believer in you should do something every day or let the thing that motivates you be something that would make your 13-year-old self extremely proud. So what is one thing that you would say to your 13-year-old self if given the chance?
It's so funny. My best friend from when I was 13 texted me the other day and was like, we had just launched the Grace thing and I put like a selfie on with me and Grace, like on my Instagram story. She was like, oh my God, our 13-year-old selves are flipping out right now. I don't know. I think to my 13-year-old self, I would say, it's always hard because, you know, I think like the path that you're on is like the path that you're supposed to be on, you know, and life like, you know, directs you like where you're supposed to be. So, you know, there's so much I've learned along the way that I would want that to be like a surprise, you know, but I think I would just say to be patient with yourself and be patient with the world around you, and that change and fulfillment and, you know, all of those things that you're seeking will come with time, and just to be more open to it also when it happens.
I love what you said, because I feel like when you are 13 and going through all of these things and you have so many emotions, you don't know if what you're feeling is the way to be feeling. And I think also we very much grew up in the age of, I don't know when you were 13, but I was watching things like those 90s teen movies that very much thought within binaries. And I love what you said, because it's basically just, it ties up with a really nice bow, like the ethos of Boy Smells. You are valid, your expression is wonderful, and we're here to support that.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming on the podcast today, Matthew. I had so much fun to speak.
This is a great break in my day, and I never get to do stuff like this, so it's been great. Thank you.
Come back anytime.